Welcome to the United Taste of America podcast series. This podcast is all about the great foods that make up American cuisine and where they came from. I'm your host and guide, Rick K. Jones, and I'm so pleased to bring you this series as part of the celebration of our 250th birthday of America here in 2026. Each week, we're going to go to one of the states and tell you a little bit of the history of that state, and then talk about the culinary history of the state and where the foods came from. Then we're going to select one specific dish that best exemplifies that state, and we'll go to a terrific restaurant or a place that actually prepares that dish. It's the United Taste of America from iHeart Podcast. Now, there are 50 states in the union, but of course, only one can be the first state. And that state is our state today. It's the state of Delaware. Let's talk a little bit about Delaware. Delaware is like so many of the other what we call northern colonies. Delaware was originally settled by several European nations, first by the Swedes, then the Dutch, and then ultimately the British. Well, the Dutch ran the Swedes off, and then, of course, the British ran the Dutch off. For decades, Delaware was not its own colony. It was part of the state was in Maryland, and part of the state was in Pennsylvania. Actually, William Penn, when he got the charter for Pennsylvania, he wanted parts of the Delaware Bay for Pennsylvania because that's the way they could bring in goods and services. And then there was a long-standing debate about the dividing line of Maryland and Delaware. And a couple of people you may have heard of. The dispute was finally settled by a couple of guys named Charles Mason and Jeremiah Dixon. You've heard of that, the famous Mason-Dixon line that historically was the dividing line between the North and the South. Delaware did not become a colony, one of the 13 colonies, until right before the American Revolution, when they took land, part of the land from Pennsylvania, and again, part of the land from Maryland, to create this new colony. But after the war, on December 7th, 1787, Delaware became the first state in the new union. Now, a famous family came from France and settled in the Brandywine Valley of Delaware. They were the DuPonts. If you know the history of the American Revolution, we did not make gunpowder. So we're fighting the British basically without a lot of gunpowder. We were having to bring that gunpowder in from other sources, primarily from France. And the DuPont family was French, and they came and they settled in the Brandywine Valley again and started making gunpowder in 1800. They came in 1800. They started making gunpowder in 1804. And pretty timely because we got to fight the British again 8 years later in the War of 1812. But now we have our own sources of gunpowder. And you know, today the DuPont Chemical Company is one of the largest chemical companies in the world and has played a huge role in the growth and development of Delaware and of our country from that standpoint. You may not know this, but Delaware is also the site of the oldest black church in the country that was chartered in 1813. You're going to see that Delaware is an interesting state. It's progressive and not so progressive. It's this balance of both. And so I guess you would consider it to be what we would call a moderate state. They also constructed the Chesapeake and Delaware Canal. We built one of the earliest canals in 1820 that allowed them to ship goods and services from rivers out to the sea. And that really grew the shipping interest of Delaware, especially around Wilmington and those areas. Delaware was a very unique state during the Civil War. It was a buffer state. It was one of only 4 slave states that remained in the Union. And the state was kind of divided geographically. The southern part of Delaware was very agricultural-oriented, and they were very pro-Confederacy. The northern part of Delaware was very industrial, and they were very pro-Union. It's interesting, most of the politicians in Delaware went to President Lincoln and said, let the South go. Let's don't fight them. If they want to leave, let them go. But the DuPont family was like, no. We can't do that. We got to keep the Union together. And so ultimately Delaware sent soldiers and helped fund the taxes and the things that paid for the Civil War. Delaware was also an integral place along what we call the Underground Railroad. It was a place that once you crossed from Maryland into Delaware as a slave, you were now freed. But it's weird. After the war, Delaware kind of reverted back to being more of a Jim Crow state. They were more Southern oriented, and they had laws that persecuted blacks and promoted segregation. In fact, schools remained segregated in Delaware until 1967. So they were one of the later states to actually integrate their school system. Today, there's so many companies incorporated in the state of Delaware because they have very friendly tax laws and tax practices, plus they have a special court to handle corporate cases. And so it's thought that over 60% of our Fortune 500 companies are actually incorporated in Delaware, even though they're not based in Delaware. Former President Joe Biden, you know him as being from Delaware. He actually was not born in Delaware. He was born in Scranton, Pennsylvania, but he is known as the only president so far from the state of Delaware. We got a pretty interesting and very diverse musical playlist today about the state of Delaware. It starts with a great song called Delaware Slide. It's from George Thorogood and the Destroyers. There's a song by Arbor Season called Delaware, another one by John Flynn called Dover, song called Hello, I'm in Delaware by a band called City and Color. And finally, the African-American country music artist Jimmy Allen has a great song called Down Home about Delaware. So let's now talk about the reason we do this podcast, about the culinary history of the state of Delaware. Delaware is that classic middle Atlantic state on the coast, so it's known for great, great seafood. Things like crabs and clams and oysters and fish that you get out of the Atlantic Ocean. They also have classic old beach resorts. In fact, legend has it that saltwater taffy was invented in Rehoboth Beach, Delaware, at a place that still exists today called Dolly's, which is kind of interesting. The boardwalk's also famous for those what we call iconic boardwalk dishes: French fries, onion rings, hamburgers, hot dogs, and pizza up and down the coast of Delaware. But further inland, you become more about rolling hills and agriculture. And Delaware was very famous early on for chicken dishes. They grew a lot of chickens in Delaware. And they have a special dish there called slippery dumplings. Now, where I come from in the South, we call that chicken and dumplings. But these are a little bit different. In Delaware, they're also known as slickers or slickies. And this chicken dish is made with large diamond-shaped dumplings instead of noodles. And the dumplings are made of flour, baking powder, salt, and shortening. And then they're boiled in the chicken broth, which makes them what? Very slippery and very, very good. Now, Delaware was also one of the early dairy states. Why was that? Because the Dutch settled there, and the Dutch brought dairy cows. Every place that the Dutch settled became early dairy states. And so, therefore, they started making ice cream early in the state of Delaware. Now, we didn't invent ice cream here in America, but I like to think we perfected it. And there's probably no more iconic American dish than a cone or a cup of ice cream, freshly made, homemade ice cream. And Delaware is full of small places that make and serve ice cream. Legend has it that George Washington loved ice cream and often served it at Mount Vernon. In fact, it is said that he actually learned how to make ice cream from an African slave from where? Delaware. So we're going to spotlight today one of the great and unique stories about ice cream in the state of Delaware. One of the best ice cream creameries in the state is at a place called Woodside Farm Creamery, and it's an amazing story. Woodside Farm has been in the same family, the Mitchell family, since that family bought that land. They bought 1,000 acres in 1796. So for 300 years or 230 years, they have been a dairy farm in Delaware, the Mitchell family. They actually bought the land from someone who had recently bought the land from William Penn's estate. So this particular property was originally owned by William Penn. Then one family owned it for a very short period of time, and in 1796, the Mitchell family bought it. Now, what's interesting is the Mitchell family still runs it, which means it was men. They're still named Mitchell over multi-generations of people. Hey, folks, in 1796, George Washington was still president of the United States. Pretty incredible story for our 250th birthday. The Mitchells were an English Quaker family. And again, as I mentioned, they bought the farm with 1,000 acres. Now, today the farm is 75 acres, so over the years they've sold off some of the land. They raised dairy cows on that farm until 1961. And in 61, they took the cows off the farm and they grew crops and they did a number of other things. But the current owners, Jim and Janet Mitchell, brought back the Jersey cows in 1995, and they opened the creamery in 1998. Jim actually went to Penn State and got a degree in ice cream. If you've been to Penn State, they have a famous creamery there, and they're known for teaching people how to make ice cream. And so Jim's dad still lives there in the home that the family built in 1804 that's on the property. His dad's 96, and his sister still lives there, and they still work on the farm. And as I mentioned, Jim learned to make ice cream because he knew that the ice cream was going to allow them to remain as farmers. Now, they grow their own hay for the cows. They milk the cows 3 times a day. Then the raw milk is sent to be pasteurized with some fat added. Then it comes back to the farm, and this is when they do the magic. They add the sugar, they add some other additives, they add flavoring, and they make amazing small batch ice cream. They sell that ice cream on they have a little shop there on site, and they employ a lot of teenagers. It's really kind of a neat family business, but they also sell their ice cream to restaurants in the area for desserts, to other small ice cream shops, and they do catering. They do ice cream socials that allows them to grow their business and that kind of thing. They also make ice cream pies every Christmas holiday season. I got to know Jim and Janet, and they are living the American dream. They're just terrific people. Here they are living on the land of their ancestors. Our trip the day we spent with them on the farm was really terrific. Janet met Ryan and I, when we first got there, and she gave us a tour of the farm. And then we went to see the baby Jersey cows, which were precious, the little cows that are separated from the adults. They were in their own barn. And then we walked down to the pasture to the pond at the bottom of the land, and there were the Jersey cows. And then as we walked back, the cows got in a single file and walked with us because it was time for them to go be milked at the automated milking machines. And so, like I said, 3 times a day, they go and are milked, and they do it themselves. And then I had a chance to meet Jim. He had been out cutting hay. And he grows so much hay that he not only feeds his cows, but he sells some of it to others in the area for their cattle. And then I sat down with Jim, and we talked a little bit about the farm and about the family history. Can you imagine 230 years of Mitchell family history on one place? it's pretty special. And so when you see the video, our vignette series, you're going to see me having the tour of the farm and interviewing Jim. Speaking of that vignette series, you can find it two places. It's on iHeart's YouTube channel, and it's also on our own YouTube channel called United Taste of America. And you can watch each week and see the places we've traveled to and the people that we've met on the United States of America tour. You know, as we traveled around the country, it reminded me that so few Americans have any clue where food comes from. We go to the grocery store and we buy food. We don't quite understand somebody actually has to grow the food. They have to process the food. They have to refine the food. They have to package the food. They have to ship the food. All that is a big, big process. You talk about national security issues. We don't grow enough food in America to feed our people. Think about that. We have to import a lot of food from all over the world. We cannot feed our own people because farming has been de-emphasized. At one time, 80% of the people in America lived an agrarian lifestyle. They grew their own crops. And we don't do that anymore. In fact, we're having some problems because so many farmers are over 60 years of age. And so if we're going to continue to grow food, we got to make farming cool again. We got to make it profitable again. We got to make it where people can raise a family by growing food because we keep talking about artificial intelligence. There's no AI for eating, okay? We have to eat food, and somebody has to grow the food and do all that. I have a new newsletter that you can get called On the Road with Rick that's out there, and it's all about great places to eat across the country, and many of them are small places that have been historically part of the community and part of the family. The first issue came out in December, and it was all about fried chicken, which is my favorite food. And you can get that from us. Just let us know if you want to get it once a month. It's free, On the Road with Rick. But let's get back to ice cream. You got to grow feed for the cows, and then the cows produce the milk. And then you have to milk the cows. Then you have to process the milk and make cream. Then you have to add sugar. Then you have to add flavors, and you have to do all the kind of things. It's quite a journey, as are all foods. You know, ice cream was really supposedly invented back during the Roman era. Emperor Nero took ice and fruit toppings and made a form of ice cream. But it was really the Arabs and around the 8th century that added sugar and dairy products to fruit and to ice and started ice cream. And then we got you remember that old hand crank ice cream crank? Well, it was really invented in the 19th century. I can remember as a child having a wooden crank, and you would fill the canister up with cream and sugar and flavorings, and then you would put ice and what we call rock salt. And you would crank it and crank it and crank it and crank it. And you, Mom, how much longer? And then you would great ice cream. I love peach ice cream. It's probably one of my favorites that we would make homemade. My favorite ice cream, though, they do at the Woodside Creamery is butter pecan. I love butter pecan. Folks, there's nothing better than ice cream on a hot summer day, and it's probably none better than what you'll find at Mitchell's Woodside Creamery in Delaware. Another feature each week on the United Taste of America podcast series is 3 from me. 3 additional great restaurants in each state that you got to try. So here are 3 outstanding yet very different restaurants that I think you should try in Delaware. The first is down there in Rehoboth Beach. We talked about Rehoboth Beach being a beach town, a resort town, place where you can get saltwater taffy. This place is called the Henlopen City Oyster House. I've eaten there. It's phenomenal. No reservations. Got to queue up. Menu changes virtually every day based on what he got out of the sea, what he bought. And so they serve great Delaware and what we call regional seafood like, middle neck clams or clams casino, fried oysters. They make a mean lobster mac and cheese, a lot more great seafood products. Again, it's the Henlopen City Oyster House in Rehoboth Beach. The second one is another seafood joint just up the coast in a place called Bethany Beach. And this place is called Off the Hook. And again, great seafood. They have wonderful fried calamari, and they have this cool starter called crab fries, French fries that basically have crab seasoning and a little bit of crab sprinkled in the fries. It's unbelievable. They also have a great chiapino. I'm a big chiapino fan, which is basically a Portuguese seafood dish, and they do a mean one there. They got great, amazing food. And then the third restaurant is, let's spotlight another great American classic, the Hamburger. Probably the best hamburger place maybe in the whole Mid-Atlantic is a place in Dover called Restaurant 55. And they have literally dozens and dozens of hamburger choices there. I love a great burger at Restaurant 55 in Dover, Delaware. So, folks, that wraps up state number 1, Delaware. It's just our first stop of 50 stops on the United Taste of America tour. And we'll see you back here next week from state number 2, which is the state of Pennsylvania.